This is The Comfy Chairs, a podcast from 123 Limited, and I'm your host, Kate. If I'm being honest, and I am, I've always found the guidance around active listening to be somewhat lacking. This is not to say that active listening is not a valuable skill and an important leadership competency. It is. But all too often, what we're taught only scratches the surface of what it is and why it matters. And in some cases, we're left with the impression that active listening means sitting still and quiet like an empty vessel. Now, as appealing as that can be, it won't get us anywhere productive when it comes to effective communication and leadership impact. So what's the solution? Do we throw out active listening in favor of something else? Or do we deepen our understanding and expand our language about what works best when it comes to listening? I think this is what is called for. Learning more about the interplay of thoughts, actions, and emotions that occur when we speak and when we listen. I'm fortunate to have the chance today to speak to an expert. Bailey is a speech and communication coach who teaches pronunciation and intonation for non-native and regional American English speakers, and provides professional training in speech and communication, including listening skills. Bailey, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me in the comfy chairs. As I've told you, I love to ask my guests to introduce themselves, so please.
Yes, thank you. I am really looking forward to talking to you about this. So I am Bailey Massey. I am a speech and communication coach, and I do a lot. I have a master's degree in communication science and previously worked as a speech therapist, but most recently I have been working on public speaking, helping with presentation skills, interpersonal communication, accent modification, and I could go on and on and on because communication is everywhere and needed for everything. So I help with all of that.
It's one of the things that for myself, I know I kind of tried to ignore growing up. And the older I get and the more experience I have, communication is that foundation to absolutely every interaction that we have. And if we're going to lead people, we better be able to communicate with at least a modicum of empathy and effectiveness. I've been in the habit before when people, in my past life, when people would approach me about training and say, well, I need to do communication training with my team. Like, that's a really big bucket. Let's get more detailed. Communication's a lot of stuff. So let's get more detailed. So that's one of the things I kind of want to start off with is we're not trying to cover all of the aspects of communication today. We're going to sit in the space that's still pretty big, but try to get very focused on listening. And I know that when we did our prep call, you shared that one of your focus areas is not just on the skill of listening, but also what does that receiving end of communication look like? So all of that to say that I think the best place for us to start our conversation today is talking about if we say active listening, or if we talk about listening skills, what is it that we mean by that? What is active listening and what is it not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And because you're right, it's so essential. It's an essential component of communication that you need in order to do the expressive side of that. I think to answer that, I want to start with what it's not, because I think the internet is full of tips and tricks of how to actively listen that don't really work. So basically, the internet's great sometimes.
Sometimes.
For many things, right? But in general, it's definitely not just looking and nodding, saying things like, oh, wow, yeah, oh, cool, because that's fake. And it often can look fake and feel fake, and people pick up on that, especially if they have pretty good intuition. And what I think is one of the greatest things about truly actively listening is that if you're really doing it, you don't have to fake or do anything. You're there, you're present, you're in it. And I think with that being kind of the focus of what's happening there, in terms of what it is, I think it's a component of hearing before responding, understanding what you're hearing, again, before responding, and then really reflecting on not only the things that you're hearing, but the things that you're seeing, so the verbal and the nonverbal component, and then considering the context, the environment, what clarifications or questions pop up, and then making sure that you're storing and really retaining that information so that it's not just gone, so you can immediately just get to what you wanted to say in the first place.
I'm a little hesitant to get too technical because I am talking with someone with deep education. And what I hear in that explanation is that there are elements that have to do with our thoughts, our feelings, and our physical presence.
Yeah.
And I know that they're highly interconnected, and I think it can be helpful for us to pull those apart and say, what's happening cognitively? What's happening emotionally? What's happening behaviorally when we are listening well? So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're kind of getting into just the complexity of it all that is part of the issue I think we see with the breakdown that so many people have, in that nobody's taught how to listen beyond, did you hear me? And then kind of going further. Because I think with what you're describing with the cognitive, the emotional, the behavioral, a lot of that is awareness that we need to develop in ourselves. So if I were to think about the cognitive side, I automatically think of our attention and our focus, because there's so many things that can get in the way of our attention. So I know before our call, I mentioned that my son is home, school hasn't started yet. I had to make sure that he was somewhere else because I wanted to truly listen to you, because I knew my attention would be somewhat divided if I was like, okay, is anything breaking outside of my office, right? So little things like that, there's also my own personal ego and my own biases that could really influence the entire conversation and how I interpret things. So I think there's that component that leads into the emotions in terms of, am I frustrated? Have you triggered me in some way? Am I exhausted to where I can't focus and actually hear you? And then what is my body doing because I'm tired? Am I losing that eye contact? And there's just so many components of needing it all to happen. So it makes sense why we have miscommunication so often.
It's really interesting, Bailey. You said nobody's taught how to listen, and hearing is one of our senses. We're built to hear things.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that distinction between, have I heard, have I comprehended, have I listened?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's fascinating that, I mean, we know we have to teach people to talk. We have to teach people to walk. We have to make certain babies understand touch and the parameters around that. But we don't focus on the distinction between hearing and listening.
But we always expect it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is probably not fair.
It's not. It really
to
isn't.
Ourselves and others.
Yeah. It's kind of fascinating because I'm trying to see if I can follow this little trail of thought that I have. I had a conversation last week with somebody that was talking about how people leave the school system and they enter the workforce, and unfortunately they're so different, and the expectation changes with no real instruction. Okay, now you need to be independent and autonomous. Don't be too reliant on supervision. Like, where in school you had to be very aware of positions of authority. And I'm just kind of connecting to that and thinking about the fact that we expect something that we're never taught.
I think it also ties into the understanding of other people and recognizing and listening to the differences in, my interpretation of something might be very different for somebody else's. And there's so many factors. And so we're also not taught the general like practices of it, but we're also not taught to identify the nuance with it.
Mm-hmm. So if you were Queen Bailey, and you could say, here's when and how we're going to start teaching people better listening, what would that look like, do you think?
Oh goodness, that is a really great question. I think that it would be always and never stopping.
Okay.
And
I like it.
and I say that in the sense that I think it's something that we need to very empathetically and cautiously develop in children because they can't do all of those things. We also need to consider that we all process differently. Like the way I listen or in a neurotypical person listens is different from, there's just so many different styles and things that we need. So we need to respect all of that and consider the broad kind of spectrum of people in general. And then I think that there should be like a catch up of, hey, you're now entering this stage of life. You're entering this situation, like an ongoing thing that everybody's constantly aware of. And I think that that would lead to more empathy and more respect and better relationships and less conflict.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned styles. That's something I definitely wanted us to talk about. There was an article from Harvard Business Review that I shared with you, and it'll be in the show notes as well, that talks about default listening style. Mm-hmm. And I kind of had this little train of thought, like, well, if there are styles, then it logically follows that there are circumstances when one style might be better than another. Mm-hmm. So kind of what are the standard styles and how do we adapt and stay agile in that space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved that article. I had not read that before, and I love that take on it. And I think that in order to be agile and make those changes, that we can't have expectations that are set in stone and that it really needs to fluctuate. I know in that article they talked about one was a very like task-oriented style, which in my brain, as I was reading that, I was like, okay, that's like house sitter listening. If I'm a house sitter, I need to be very task-oriented in how I'm listening, with details. Trash day is Tuesday, not Wednesday, things like that, right? Versus something that is analytical, that needs to be very neutral, non-emotional. In my brain, I viewed that as like elementary school principal listening, where they have to sit down and not react, but hear all the sides, understand what's happening, take it all in, and not go into that with like, well, little Billy is the one that caused this problem, but really taking it all. So I think that, yeah, it very much depends on the situation. And it also requires us to be aware of what our default settings are in the first place so that we can prevent ourselves from doing the exact same thing every time.
Also, when we talk about there being a variety of styles, the ways we listen, I think it opens up a really interesting conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. There's the empathy around understanding that somebody may not have the same listening style or skill or even capability that you do, that the way I effectively listen may not look the same, and that sometimes we have to sort of even the playing ground, particularly if we're dealing with people that have had developmental issues or maybe have something like a hearing loss.
Yes.
I mentioned to you before we started that I'll be taking a lot of notes, and that's actually what facilitates my listening, is note taking. I may never look at these again, but by capturing things, it connects me to what I've heard and helps me process. And I've learned that, particularly in meetings and professional settings, I have to be vocal about that so that people understand I'm not being rude. This is how I function best. So there's self-awareness, but there's also putting things out there so that other people are aware. I've talked a lot. Would love to hear your thoughts on the question of listening style and other listening needs. and what that can mean for building diverse, equitable, and inclusive teams.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that we all have our own unique styles. There's patterns that exist. And one thing that I've noticed, like what you're mentioning with, having to write notes down, that's how you process. I also think that that is something that did not have a negative view years ago. I think
Mm-hmm.
the existence of us being face to face through a computer on Zoom has made us feel like we have to only be in front of us. But if we were to take our Zoom videos and put them into a meeting room face to face from somebody else at a table, nobody would bat an eye at you being like, oh, okay, and like writing something down. Nobody would be like, what is she doing? It would very much be like, oh, she's engaged, she cares, she's writing it down. And so I think just society shifts and things look different, we create expectations for ourselves that nobody's really putting on us. But to your point, it is helpful to communicate what works for you and advocate for yourself. I will be taking notes because I need to. Just as some people listen better while making eye contact, and other people cannot make eye contact while listening if they want to absorb that. So I think that there definitely needs to be an appreciation of advocating, but also an acceptance of, are we getting to the end goal?
Mm-hmm.
Does it matter what that looks like? Of course, we want to be respectful in all of those things, but at the end of the day, we probably all have the same end goal, and let's get there.
Because my focus is almost always about leaders, and are they learning and are they helping people around them learn? I'm thinking about a leader integrating a new employee into their team. And it is such a great opportunity to say, hey, I want to make certain you understand kind of what our terms of engagement, our standard operating procedure is around how we listen. That, it's not just us talking and communicating with people, that listening is an important part of the work and how we are as a team, theoretically. Mm-hmm. And, we want to understand what works best for you and for you to know what works best for the people with whom you now work so that you can all be effective. And, there can be a time and place. Like, again, I'm a note taker, but there are like high conflict situations where being like, no, I have to take all the notes right now, it may not be appropriate. So also just creating what are the ways that we interact with each other and setting that baseline. It's a chance to do a little bit of, hey, we're teaching you how to listen and what that looks like in our culture. But we're also getting to know what works for you so that you can be the most effective.
Yeah. So I would say, I think that's really important. Is that a thing that people do? Because they should.
I don't think they do. And I'm thinking back, I've had the opportunity to, hire and onboard, a bushel of new employees in my time. And I've talked with them about kind of work styles and, learning styles and how we are in meetings, but never about the specific details around, tell me how you listen. How do you need information processed?
And to kind of tie it back to what we talked about in the beginning, I feel like I've heard from a lot of the people I work with that they do ask, what communication style do you prefer? Would you like me to call you or send an email? Mm-hmm. Or like that external, like expressive preference? But now that you're mentioning it, I don't know if that's happening, but I think there's value there. And I think that being able to, one, just share that it's important and that it's recognized is going to make somebody who maybe never even thought about it start to pay attention to it. And so it's probably something that can be a very organic and ongoing awareness building, because anytime somebody moves in or out of a team, that's going to change. Mm-hmm. And when stress levels change, that's going to change. And maybe holiday season's really stressful. And so the environment and all, like, I feel like there's going to be a lot of shifting. So it shouldn't be a very black and white policy.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think it's more of that idea of like, here's the operating manual, for me as a person, but then also for the teams or frankly the families. I could see there being a lot of application, coming together as a family and saying, let's some of our issues as a family have to do with the fact that we listen differently.
Mhm.
Is it
Yeah.
possible for us to get to the meat of what that looks like and manage our expectations of each other so we can kind of take that point of potential friction just off the table?
Yeah, that's a really, and that goes into like the personality styles that
Mm-hmm.
influence one way or the other.
Yeah.
Because am I a really reactive person and I like jump to what I think I heard means, or am I going to
Yeah.
process and take my time? And I think it's important for it's very two-sided. So internally, I need to know, am I going to immediately think something, or am I going to be able to stew on it for a minute? And then in terms of the other side, what I'm looking at externally to whoever I'm listening to, is their reaction a quick one or a very cautious, deliberate, patient one? Like where is that on
Mm-hmm.
both sides? Yeah.
Yeah. I love bringing in, personality and other traits and characteristics to this, because listening and the way we're talking about it, it's always a sender and receiver. So you've got all of these complexities about how even the people we're closest with, we can never fully know each other, which is a little bit of a cliche at this point, but also entirely true. So even if, you're my dearest friend, you're my spouse, you're my parent, there's always that barrier, of we're never going to be inside each other's heads. So am I aware of how I do things, how I come across, and am I paying attention to what your needs and what your experience is as well? Again, awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. And that what you just said made me think about kind of the cycle or the chain of communication, in the
Mm,
sense that there's so many components to why you can't truly know and be inside somebody's head, right?
yeah.
Where you're the person with the message. So there's all of your internal stuff, your message itself, whatever comes out. You then send it in whatever situation you're in, whether maybe it's a really loud restaurant, maybe there's chaos all around you, maybe it's a
Mm-hmm.
very one-on-one conversation. But then there's the person who's getting the response, that's listening to you,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's their interpretation of it.
Yep.
But all of this is is impacted by the context and everything else within there, and that's constantly changing.
Yeah. You said something about the cycle or chain of communication. Is that something you can walk me through, or is that just a particular term that you used?
Yeah, so that's kind of that might be the technical term for it, I'm not
Okay.
sure. But in general, it's that if we think about it as what the communication is existing within, that's where we get the context. That's where we get just the channel itself, where the communication is happening. So a conversation at the kitchen table is likely going to be very different from a conversation like in a courtroom.
Okay.
That environment really makes a big difference. And then the context itself. So are we talking about something super casual, or is it very, very deep and intense? So everything exists in some variation of that. But then inside, if we really simplify it and just have two people, we have that sender and that receiver. So then the chain or that cycle is going to start with the person, their message, the mode with which that message is communicated. So is it a text message? A text message that lacks the tone of voice and the body language?
Mm.
Or are you in front of somebody? Then there's the person who's receiving the message, and then their interpretation of it, and then response as it kind of volleys back and forth. And every single component of this is room for the chain to break, or a problem to occur, or miscommunication to happen.
In your experience, where does communication break down most often?
Oh gosh. I think that there are lots of places, and for each person, it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
Which seems like a terrible answer, but I think that, and I'll use myself. So my husband always laughs that I cannot have a conversation or listen or respond if I am distracted in any way. If there is loud noise, if I am writing something, can't happen. So for me, it's very much the environment and the situation around me. I have a lot of clients who sometimes have it in their head, but they just cannot get it out. So their message gets jumbled and wordy and all over the place. But then there's also people who misinterpret things and really take it personally, let their ego get in the way, or feel very rigid when they receive it. So I think it really depends on, again, going back to that, identify your own stuff so that you can modify and try to make adjustments.
Thank you. One of the things that started kind of sparking for me was that issue that many times the intent of what we want to say or do doesn't always match the impact that it has. And I think it's accurate to say that listening plays a role in that. And that's not to put all of the onus onto the listener, but it is like, am I responding emotionally? Am I not considering the context, the background, the person? I'm curious to know if you have any thoughts on that too.
So I think that, yes, absolutely, it's on the listener to kind of take that in. But I think that at the same time, a listener can only take in what they're given.
Correct.
So an issue that I also see with many people is, especially if they're nervous in some situation, they might talk really, really fast and everything's together and there's no pause and then there's no way to know. Like it's either super fast or maybe it's just very monotone and there's no way to interpret anything specific.
Yeah.
So I have a favorite statistic.
Oh, I want to hear
it. So that is that 7% of the meaning that you receive from a message that somebody shares is coming from the words themselves. 38% of that meaning comes from the tone of voice that that person is using. And then 55% is coming from the body language. So I love this because it shows how or why text messages are misinterpreted all the time. Because I could be saying to you, I'm so excited to see you, or I'm so excited to see you. And that is very different, right? So there's all of those components. The power we have over our delivery it's so fascinating and exciting to me. I love helping people find ways to add and be more clear in their delivery. And then there's also that component of that body language where if I am very cold and rigid and stiff, even if, clients all the time say to me, I'm a really happy person. I'm really nice. Everybody thinks I'm mad or everybody thinks that I'm being like this, or that, and they're misinterpreted. And it's like, okay, well, what are the signs that you're showing? If your body is communicating that, it's going to be received that way. And so there's very much that, again, one can't exist without the other, I think is the main theme here.
I think it's fascinating what you're saying. The content, the verbiage almost doesn't matter. The statistics there, 7% is pretty de minimis.
That's a very small amount.
Yeah. Your tone and then your physical presence really, really are the things that influence that. And listening and body language seem like they should be entirely separate issues. But no, it's holistic. We're our whole selves when we try to engage in that, and we kind of owe it to each other to think about the whole person and am I providing something that will work for them?
Yeah. And in that, recognizing when they're uncomfortable or like they're confused or something, that body language is usually the first sign, because it's often subconscious that somebody's like, their face kind of tweaks, or maybe they're uncomfortable and they like literally like start to get smaller, but their whole presence shrinks, right? And if we're only listening with our ears, in that sense and trying to understand what is said, we're missing those really valuable cues that if we ignore them and we continue to push through, we're kind of betraying trust and we're probably damaging that relationship.
We keep talking, we keep coming back to awareness of self and others. That is the foundation of emotional intelligence. Mm-hmm. So I see that empathy and curiosity have a big part to play in our effective listening, both directions.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's another one of those can't have one without the other things, because in order to be empathetic, you have to be curious, to dig deeper, to understand, to just seek better clarity. And I think it's hard not to be empathetic if you've truly done the work to get to that point, because then you're understanding it and you can see the other person's perspective. So absolutely.
I agree with that. I mean, probably no surprise. One of the things I've been thinking about, one, is struggling with that whole, the standard is you're not listening. Listening is not waiting to talk. Mm-hmm. And in a setting like this, trying to be responsive and think, okay, how does this really connect? Have I come up with a weird random idea? Am I actually listening? But I've gotten, the space I've gotten to as we're talking is thinking about the interplay between listening and comprehension. Mm-hmm. Because, again, I feel like the old school guidance on active listening is just receive. Mm-hmm. And it leaves this gap in talking about, what about my ability to understand what I've been told so that I can respond?
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know that I have a question per se, Bailey.
Well, you prompted me to think of something, and that is the fact that we are often too much in our heads and overthinking things. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, yes, there's people who are listening in order to just like, okay, you stop talking so I can say what I want to say type things. And so, of course, that's not the goal. But there's also the people that are really trying to listen to hear, but then they're like, oh gosh, should I say it this way? Is that going to come across wrong? Where do I go? And what I have seen to be most effective is to allow reactions a little bit more, because they're going to be more valid and authentic to somebody. And just because you misinterpret something, maybe you say something and I respond and you're like, well, no, that doesn't mean that I've just completely ruined the whole conversation and it was pointless. No, that's an opportunity then to make adjustments. So I think that getting out of our own way, throwing our ego aside, and allowing for error, because we're people. We're not robots. It's going to happen.
I appreciate that you brought overthinking into the conversation. Even though we're recording well ahead of when this episode is going to come out in real time, the next episode that I'm publishing is all about overthinking. Oh. And the woman with whom I got to have that conversation, that's what she coaches on. Oh. And really focuses on what's the motivation. And when we talk about communication and listening and speaking in ways that people can hear, I think motivation does have a part to play. What am I trying to accomplish in the conversation, with this message, where I'm giving it, what I'm saying specifically, how I'm presenting it? In your coaching, do you see motivation playing a role in people's effectiveness?
Yes. And I've never labeled it that way, but I love that. What I've seen is that there is a very clear expectation and goal, like an end point that people are trying to get to, which, in a professional setting, we do need to get stuff done. So understandable. But I think that there is the thought that it needs to be a very straight line to get to that. And I think that taking the road less traveled, kind of letting it spider web and then, or eventually funneling to the point is much more effective because you're maybe getting a glimpse of different perspectives. You're maybe being able to build rapport with the person you're talking to and better understand their style, their motives, where they are, to then find a way to meet in the middle. And I think that is where the best communication happens because it becomes the most balanced.
Yeah. Yeah. I keep going back to awareness, but in the sense that it's like the pre-work that we need to do.
Mm-hmm.
If we talk about how overthinking or being too much in our heads or thinking too much, whatever the line is, we like detach ourselves from the communication, the opportunity to connect.
Mm-hmm.
So there is kind of this, I'm going to go in not without thought per se, but I'm going to go in kind of ready to receive and to be present is probably the best way. You talked about attention and focus earlier as cognitive aspects, but it's kind of like, I feel like you have to do this warm up of awareness constantly in order to be primed for good listening and good, I guess, giving. I don't want to just say speaking, but it's how things that are happening in between us during that dialogue.
Yeah, and I think that's where the tone and the emotional component comes in. And I know, like you mentioned, being present. And one of the things I always coach people on when they're working on delivering in a weekly meeting or giving a presentation, whatever their communication thing is, it's probably very rare that it's a spontaneous, all of a sudden top of mind, never thought about it before type of a situation. And so I'm always like, you can do two things at once really simply to make everything else in the future easier. And what that is to be present in the moment, acknowledge, oh gosh, this was really frustrating and hard, but then this happened and we accomplished this great thing. So then when you're in the meeting explaining what happened, you don't have to force anything. You can just pull from that emotional concept that is going to bring the memory forward even faster, just processing wise, because it's going to be attached to more cognitively. And then it's going to come out and your delivery is going to have emotion behind it. And it's not going to fall flat because you can build on that. So I think the presence and the awareness and not getting stuck in our head, not just overthinking, but just especially professionals who are busy, their noses are down, they're working, they're just going to the next thing, as opposed to being, people in general, it's not just professionals.
Yeah.
Be there, exist, acknowledge.
We would change so much about personal experience, human interactions, our relationships, if we could just stop and be present. And I think one of the reasons, there's the complexity. I think that's one of the reasons that nobody teaches people how to listen, because it's so
hard.
Nuanced, and you get into, like, you could go down the path of just the cognitive aspects. You can go down just the path of the behavioral. It's hard to actually talk about what listening is and what it does and perception and all the things. But then it is hard for us to talk about it, to teach it, to do it well, because of the level of distraction that we experience. And I think that's not unique necessarily just to the modern world. We could talk about phones, we could talk about social media, we could talk about how busy people are.
That definitely doesn't help.
It doesn't help. The human brain, the human body is designed to receive input constantly, right? And we can only process so much of that. We get more input than we're able to chew, if you will. We're constantly flooded with stuff in our environment. So, of course, listening is a challenge because it does require a physical act, an emotional investment, and a cognitive load to happen well.
Oh, I was thinking about what you mentioned, and like, of course, it's easy to call out phones and everything. I think back to just let's say 100 something years ago, maybe longer, but if we have much more technology and things available to us, not just in phone style, but science has progressed. So,
Mm-hmm.
I'm diabetic. I don't have to worry about my blood sugar dropping all the time because I have a super fancy insulin pump that handles that. If I was alive hundreds of years ago, that would have been a component of maybe my sugar's low and I can't focus. And so
Yeah.
I think that with everything that we gain, we also lose something, but it's probably never not been a challenge.
Yeah, I agree. I agree entirely. Even, if we want to go even farther back, hundreds or thousands of years, if you are in a state of pure survival and listening and hearing things is essential to your survival, but you're also inundated by the things that are a risk to you, it's going to impact your ability to listen.
Oh,
It
absolutely.
just gets me thinking that we would do ourselves collectively such a favor if we had more compassion.
Yeah, that would help
Yeah.
for
Just
ourselves and others.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah. That better listening can come through care
yeah.
and not just I am taking care to listen well, but also when I speak, that I have compassion for the fact that you may be going through something I don't know. You could have a blood sugar issue. There could be something at home that is
Mhm.
taking up half of your brain power. Um,
Yeah.
you've got 7 meetings after this one. So listening may not be something you can do at full capacity in the moment. And if we
Mhm.
could have a little bit more compassion and patience, I'm, I wonder if we wouldn't constantly be talking about, well, they just don't listen.
Yeah, I don't think that would be the case.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if we truly were coming at it from that situation, yeah, I think that it would be like, okay, they are probably having a bad day. I know they just, maybe it's not bad news. Maybe they just found out that their best friend got engaged and they're just like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to talk to, like, that's still a distraction, even
It
though it's
is.
positive.
Yeah. Thank you for
There's
taking
so
us to
many,
the positive side of that, too.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the internal distractions, the like, oh, this chair is uncomfortable, or my
Mm-hmm.
pants are too tight, or whatever. There's the physical, there's also it's loud, there's a lawnmower, or, you know, I have the meetings. All there, we just need to be more empathetic
Yeah.
of other people. It comes back to that again.
Yeah. Well, I love the fact that it's not, it is about, are we, are we equal partners in it? Not, I have all the responsibility to listen or I have all the responsibility to speak in a way that you can hear me. It's, we share that responsibility if we're going to be in communication.
Yeah.
And if there's a breakdown, it's not that, I mean, of course, it could be that one person is at fault and the other isn't, but that we're constantly creating like these little social contracts and little agreements to do better, well, different with each other.
Yeah. And I think there's, at least for myself, recognizing and like it's a constant work in progress because, and I'm sure for many people, there's somebody in their lives who they're like, oh, they're just really hard to have a conversation with because they just steamroll and take
Mm-hmm.
it over. And it's so hard. And, there's plenty of people in my life that are like that. But over time, I've been able to recognize, okay, it's this component of their personality. It's because of like, there's so many different factors to try to look beyond that and see what's leading to that. And in many of those situations, it is not my place to tell them what they're doing, but in some of them, based on the relationship and the trust that I have, I can communicate. You know what, sometimes if you keep going, I feel like I'm not able to get my point in there. And I really want to have that conversation with you and kind of get your thoughts on what I think. And so maybe it's a situation where that's a safe space that I can do that. Not everywhere, but it'd be great if that existed more often.
If we were clear about our needs and our preferences more in the world, I think this is connected. It may be a total change of subject, but you talked with me when we first met about how confidence really plays in to the work that you do. Confidence seems to be one of those things that is going to be a thread that runs throughout. And the connection that I just made to it was being confident to say, this is what I need.
Yeah. And I think confidence requires vulnerability.
Yes.
And letting go of control is what I think that's a big part of it.
Ooh, I like that a lot, Bailey. It seems counterintuitive on its face.
Yeah.
But yeah.
One of the things I try to make many of my clients do where this is an issue is I will ask them, what is something that you are so good at that you could talk about all day long? And if I disagreed with you, you would just be like, okay, whatever. But I know for a fact X, Y, Z, and they'll share something. And I always use horses. I could ride before I could walk. I could talk about it forever. And like, if I'm wrong about something, like I'm happy to learn, but I feel pretty good about it, whatever. And then I'm also like, okay, what is something that you are just not good at and know not very much about? And I'll use myself. For me, I'll say golf. I am terrible at golf. I know very little about it, and it is what it is. But in a conversation, I have no shame about that. I am not going to not ask somebody like, oh, wow, where's your favorite course that you've golfed on? Or like, whatever, have a back and forth conversation, because it doesn't matter. Like, I can admit that I am not good at golf, and that doesn't make me a bad person or anything. So I think that concept applies in terms of saying, I don't know, in a work environment where it's like, oh, I don't have all that information. I need to do that, or I'm not the person. I think people think that they have confidence means I know everything about everything and I never feel unsure. And you should be confident in your insecurities as well.
Yeah, I love that. Because it's absolutely right. Confidence is not just I am a rock star. Awareness and like self-knowledge is not just here are all my strengths and everything I do well. It's also, well, here's the stuff that maybe I suck at.
But how do we get better if we don't do that?
Right. Absolutely right. I want to, again, I'm seeing something kind of connect about how people approach confidence. Some of the stylistic stuff. We talked a little bit about personality earlier. I'd like to go back to that because you shared your beautiful slide deck with me. Really just gorgeous to look at, but also really rich in information. And something that, there was a lot there, but something that really caught my attention that it looks like you do some training around are the variables like personality and culture that can influence how we listen. Would love to hear more about that.
Sure. Yeah. And so you're right. The personality that we each have, the culture that we exist within is another one of those kind of two-way mirrors in a sense where you have to see yourself and then look outside. And I think this is kind of going to touch on the concept of like generalizing and stereotypes, but then recognizing that patterns exist for a reason, and that's the case, but there's so much more nuance in all of that as well. So an example of some of the things to pay attention to, we talked a little bit about like, am I somebody that is going to react really quickly, or am I going to take time to process? Maybe I am also the type of person that needs to ask a lot of questions to process information, or I need to like take a minute. So there's all of those. How assertive am I? Am I going to really receive information in a understanding and affectionate way where I'm going to like empathize with you, or am I going to be kind of dismissive of like, okay, whatever. All of those things come from somewhere, but they exist. And again, knowing inside and outside. But then what I find to be really cool to dive into is the cultural variabilities. And this is regarding things like, am I or the person I'm talking to, the type of person who is going to be very individualistic and focus on themselves, or think about a very collective approach to things? So do I base all of my choices and decisions on me alone? Or am I considering my family and my community and all of those things? Because that, as who I am, is going to impact how I'm hearing other people. But I also need to see and listen to how people phrase things to get an idea of where do they fall on that spectrum as well.
Before we started recording, we were talking about only children, siblings, family. Families have their own cultures. Every household has its own culture, and sometimes even subcultures within those. Mm-hmm. So obviously there can be like the big C culture of, different nationalities, communities, but it can even be, I'm an only child, and I come from a quiet home. Like, we were not loud and rowdy. So if there is a lot of stimulation, it's because of that cultural background that I have of being, a latchkey only child. If there's a lot of stimulation, I struggle to listen. Yeah, it just goes to, if we want to have really great communication, particularly in the workplace, particularly as leaders, the first job is to get to know your people.
And I'm also going to push back on that. Is that first, or do we need to know ourselves first? Like, what is this a chicken or an the egg situation?
Oh, you got me. Oh, you totally got me. No, because I'm always like, it starts with you. That is the thing I say about leadership. It starts with you. So, yes, the first thing after you have self-awareness is to get to know your people. And actually, those are things, I would say those are things that realistically can happen concurrently as well. Yeah. I could, if I wanted to be particularly difficult, make a case for the fact that getting to know other people helps us understand ourselves better, but that would just be for the sake of argument, and I will spare you that.
But it's also valid, and I think that's why it's so complicated, because where do you start? Where do you go? It's a lot.
Yeah, it is a really complex. One of the things that I try to do as a coach, as a consultant, as a human, is look at things that are complex and complicated and attempt to make them simpler, attempt to make them more consumable. Now, there are things that you can't always do that with. They are just complex by their nature, and you have to accept that and work the complexity. But because I crave that, can we break this down to its component parts? I'm curious if we can try to tease out some of those essentials of being a great listener.
Oh, like how to create like the framework for it. I think focusing on removing yourself and your expectations, to get out of your own head, get out of your own way, to allow yourself to hear and truly listen, to broaden and just open up your mind to have the flexibility to see different perspectives so that you can actually understand, would be the next step along that path. And then I think kind of the next step would be like a filtering to reflect. So hearing the things, processing and checking, am I thinking that just because of my experience, or am I thinking that because of what they're saying? And I think after that would be considering the environment and the context of just the whole conversation, whatever's being discussed, and then looking forward to what's next.
Can you say more about that last part?
In terms of looking forward, I think that would be finding, if it's a work situation and we need to find a solution. Obviously, we're looking in that direction, but making sure that we realize that what the next step is might be a slight detour that is going to get us some more information and benefit us getting back to the whatever the answer is or the solution is, and not feeling that we have to take the same path every single time.
Okay. I want to not poke holes in this, but I feel like there may be something missing in that, Bailey, if I may be so bold, that we went from that internal process immediately to action. And what I didn't hear in all of that was the, not just you talked about filtering to reflect. So sort of understanding, do I have a bias? That's still the internal part. What about the engagement with the other person and responding before action comes?
Responding and the part of the person speaking or the part of the person listening?
Listening.
Okay.
Listening, because I think that's one of the reasons this can get so convoluted, because in dialogue, we all play all the parts, right? And if I'm a great listener, theoretically, there is a point where what I owe the other person is at the very least acknowledgement, but more often than not, I owe a response.
So are you referring to like making sure that it's known that you're present and it's known that you're actively participating in that?
What I heard that you talked about, getting out of your own way, being open to listen, welcoming new perspectives, filtering to reflect, considering context, and then that looking forward to what's next. And it felt to me that we went from the internal act of I have received a message to I am taking action on it.
Yes.
And it just feels like, there's this piece missing.
I think I see what's supposed to go there.
Okay.
I'm thinking that is the validation and acknowledgement component.
Okay.
That is very important in many situations. So I'm wondering if that's kind of where you were like, okay, but then how does that person know that they can move forward, that they can be trusted, that somebody's seeing whether they agree or disagree, that they're seeing where they're coming from? Do you think that's kind of where you're identifying that gap?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think maybe even just acknowledge is the right way to think about it, because to your point, listening doesn't mean we agree with everything. It doesn't mean that we're excited about it. And it doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to take action as a result of having listened to someone, other than the act, the courtesy, if nothing else, the respect of saying, all right, I've listened. This is what I believe I heard. And then now what? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think with that, that acknowledgement to get to that next step can be not just regurgitating what somebody else said, but showing that like, oh, I get that for you, that's going to be really challenging, and that this is an issue because of this. I see that. Because of that, I think, and like integrating that into whatever's coming next, so that it feels it feels validating
Mm-hmm.
to whoever the other person is, whoever the person speaking is. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that is definitely an essential component.
I want to give us a gold star. I feel like we incidentally just really demonstrated what this could look like.
Go us.
On both sides. Yay. Because I asked a question and you gave me this absolutely delightful, thoughtful response. And I had some things to say about it. And we were able to go back and forth. And one, thank you for the openness to the, hey, what about this and not that? But also, yeah, just making it possible for us to do what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
That's great.
No,
it makes me think about, I know a very small amount about this, but I know it's like the 4 agreements, I believe it's called. One of them is like about not taking things personally, and something else is like staying open. And I feel like that's actually on my to-do list, is like dive deeper into that, because those concepts seem essential as well. And kind of those 2 components really, I think, are part of this as well. Probably all the components, but like I said, I'm definitely not an expert in that realm.
No, nor am I. That's something I have heard of, but I don't know either. Although I'm now going to go look it up and do
Fair enough. Well, we've got homework.
I know. Great. I love it. I also, you did make this very simple, and it's, get out of your own way, be open. The new perspectives, I always get excited about that when there's an opportunity to see and learn and encounter things that are different from what I know. I think you've made it very consumable for people, and it doesn't do the stuff that I criticized in my introduction of like, well, just sit there and wait.
Yeah, don't do that.
No. I mean, there could be a time and place, and that's another point we've covered. But I really do want to call out that there are instances where certain approaches to communication are better suited than others.
Oh, yeah.
You and I both have worked in, care settings, myself on the HR administrative side, but there can be, I think about during the pandemic where it's a little bit like you talked about the analytical, the school principal or the house sitter listening. The way we listen in high stakes environments, it's going to look different than if I'm sitting at a coffee shop with my best friend.
I think one thing also with all of that we didn't talk about, which is a whole other can of worms, but that's that critical style where we're judging and we're forcing our interpretations onto others. That is not helpful unless somebody's saying, hey, I would love your advice on XYZ. Please tell me your thoughts. In many situations, that judgmental approach is that keeping score, that grading is definitely not helpful. So being able to step away from that is also necessary.
Yeah. That's an interesting topic. I've spent a lot of time just in the last few days actually having discussions about behavioral styles and also like some educational things around critique versus criticism. I come back to what's the motivation behind how you're approaching something, and are you being transparent about that motivation? When you talk about being critical, there is I believe, a distinction between critique and criticism.
How do you describe that?
The context for this, for me, has to do with my background. I majored in English and art in undergrad. So wrote stories and painted pictures. Both of those disciplines have a practice of critique where you share the work with the class, with a group, with a professor, and then you receive a critique. And the intent of the critique is not to break you down, not to make you feel bad. It's to improve the work. It's done in a way that's somewhat structured, and always done with support. But you have this, like, you kind of have this shared understanding that this is what we're doing in this setting. And good professors, good teachers will help you set your ego aside. That's part of their teaching in this. Not because your ego doesn't matter or you're there to be beaten up by your classmates. It's, okay, you want to be a student of this discipline. This is how we're going to get better. We're going to help each other improve our work. Criticism, the stuff, the content of a critique and a criticism can sound a lot alike, but if there's no shared understanding at the front end of things that the purpose of this is for support and improvement, as opposed to, I just don't like that, you lose that. So I feel like talking about the distinction between critique and criticism is also sort of that distinction that we've highlighted a few times between, do people understand what I'm trying to say, where I'm coming from, my motivation, my background. I love that we've landed on this because I think it's a really good exemplar of, it can be the same message, but if the motivation, the context is taken out of the picture, it leaves the listener lost. Yeah. Like, do you understand that I'm saying, hey, this particular passage doesn't have great flow. I got really confused. I didn't understand what your main character was trying to accomplish. If that's set in the context of a critique, it's, oh, Bailey's trying to help me.
She wants to connect it.
Yeah. If you're saying, I got really lost and I didn't understand this, and it's in the context of criticism, I'm going to think horrible thoughts about you. Right? So I think if we can have that, am I critiquing or criticizing, it's very valuable to have that listening skill. But there has to be, again, this mutual agreement and understanding. This is how this is coming forward.
Yeah. And I think I love how you explained that, because this is an example I use in terms of tone, where if I were to use your phrase of, I got lost in this paragraph, it didn't quite connect well, right?
Mm-hmm.
I could use a tone that's very much like, I kind of got lost in this paragraph. It didn't really connect well, where it sounds like, okay, I'm kind of curious, let's build on that.
Mm-hmm.
Or I could say, I got lost in this paragraph. It didn't connect well.
Yeah.
Like exact same words.
Yep.
And there's so I told that totally makes sense in terms of the critique versus the criticism.
I keep coming back to, if we could start communication almost with having like here are our terms of engagement. If we could take the time to manage our expectations with each other, if we could be really clear up front, and if the listener can say, hey, I can totally do that, if we could have that agreement up front, it would save us so many problems on the back end.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me of it's a common joke I see with the dynamics between like best friends and like a husband and a wife, where it's like, when I call my best friends, they're going to validate me and they're going to let me just be angry or frustrated about whatever. And then my darn husband's got all these solutions that I don't want. And so it's that like, am I looking for that or not?
Yeah. Well, and that comes back to awareness, right? Do I know what I want from this?
Yeah.
And if I'm going to send a message, speak or text or whatever, do I know what I want from it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's it. It always starts with awareness.
Yeah.
Constantly.
Absolutely. Constantly changes, and it's ongoing.
Yeah. Well, it's the work of being human, isn't it? Trying to understand and trying to be understood.
Yeah, I love that.
So we've talked about a few resources. I've mentioned a Harvard Business Review article that people will be able to click on in the show notes. You have resources and training. I am curious if there are any other resources that you would recommend, either that you provide or that you've used in the past for people that want to do the hard work of understanding and being understood?
Absolutely. So I'll start with what I provide. I definitely provide one-on-one coaching to people quite often. I do a lot of group trainings, like going into organizations and companies to address all of this to teams, to really customize it to whatever their specific industry or task is. Because as we've learned today, it changes and it flows quite a bit. So whether it's a person or a group, I do a lot of that. I also, in terms of a resource, there's a book that I absolutely love, and I think it is the perfect Kickstarter to seeing and understanding the broadness of listening, and it's called You're Not Listening, and it's by Kate Murphy, and I love it. It's really, really helpful and has a lot of great insight in that. So I highly recommend that one. And then I would be very cautious with internet searches because there's good and bad. But I think in terms of a very free option that anybody has accessible to them is to consult and chat with a trusted friend, family member, colleague to be like, hey, I really want to work on my listening skills. Is there anything that stands out? Like, start the conversation. And if you're not seeing it in yourself immediately, start to ask the people you trust who are going to give you that critique, not that criticism. So I think that's a really great starting point.
I really appreciate that last piece of advice. Because you're right, we could go Google, but the phone a friend is probably going to be more immediate and formative for us too.
Yeah, AI doesn't know you.
No.
Your best friend is going to know you a lot better.
I could kind of put a footnote here. Just like everything we've talked about, you want to be clear. If you're seeking feedback on how well you listen or how effectively you listen, don't just say, hey, I'd like feedback on my listening skills. Because who knows what you're going to get. You want to be as detailed as you can. I feel like I could improve in my listening skills by being clearer in how I respond or being open in my body language. Can you pay attention over the next few days, the next week or two, and provide me with feedback about what you experience?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's important to specify like how honest you want somebody to be. Like,
Yes.
be ready to take it.
That's exactly right. I would like you to be very gentle with me right now.
Right.
Or just bring it on. Bring it on. And again, I am a broken record on this. It's awareness and it's clarity. And if we can bring those two things in, am I aware of myself? Am I aware of the other person? And am I clear about what I'm hoping to accomplish in this communication? Those two things will get us so much farther.
I agree.
Any other observations? Any final thoughts that you would like to share?
You know what? This has just been so lovely. I've had so much fun kind of going on this meandering path with you because I just could talk about this all day. So it was just, thank you so much for doing this because I feel like I have gained so much from this conversation.
Oh, I feel exactly the same. Thank you. I feel like you've been so patient with me too, because I won't lie. Talking with somebody who is a professional in the space of communication and about the topic of listening skills has had me on high alert about, am I clear? Am I listening well? Am I totally overthinking? Oh, no, she's talking. I should stop taking notes. So I surprised myself by the little bit of anxiety I had coming into this one, and it's been a delight. Thank you so much.
Oh, of course. And gold stars all around.
Yay.
I never would have noticed.
Love the gold stars.
Yes, who doesn't?
Well, thank you again. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe, leave a rating or review, or share it with others. You'll find Comfy Chairs updates and other thoughts on leadership and learning on Instagram at 123 Limited. That's ONE23 LTD.